Elijah's life had become a living nightmare. Every day was a delicate balancing act between his mounting guilt and the facade of normalcy he wore for the church, his wife, and himself. His betrayal gnawed at him, but he felt trapped. Trapped. By Delilah's manipulations, by his own weakness, and by the growing adoration she had cultivated among the congregation. Delilah was everywhere. She attended every church event, her generosity and charm winning over everyone, from the elders to the newest members. Women spoke of her kindness, men admired her resourcefulness, and the youth saw her as a role model. Her donations had transformed stalled projects into thriving successes, and her presence on the church board was seen as a blessing. But only Elijah and Grace knew the truth. Grace, perceptive as ever, had pieced together enough to see through Delilah's veneer. She had her suspicions about the depth of her husband's turmoil, though he had not confessed the extent of his involvement. She spent her nights in prayer, asking God for strength and clarity, while her days were spent trying to support Elijah without pressuring him. One evening, Grace found him sitting in the study, staring blankly at an open Bible. His face was drawn, his eyes haunted. "Elijah," she began gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've been carrying something heavy. I know you're struggling, but you can't do this alone. Please, talk to me." "Grace, I don't even know where to begin. This thing with Delilah, she is after me, Grace," he confessed. "It's like a noose tightening around me. She's everywhere, and the church adores her. If I speak out, I'll be seen as the villain. And if I stay silent, I don't know how much longer I can endure this." Grace stiffened. After her husband? Is this what Delilah was after? The hypocrite. She decided not to react. Instead, she knelt beside him, her eyes filled with compassion, hiding her fear. "Elijah, the truth will always come to light. But you must start by bringing it to God. He sees your heart, and He is the only one who can turn this mess into something redemptive. And as for the church, you don't have to fight this battle alone. We'll find a way to confront her influence, together." Elijah nodded, her words a small balm to his fractured soul. But the question loomed. How could he, a man caught in the very sin he preached against, expose Delilah without destroying himself? Delilah's visits to his office grew more frequent and brazen. She no longer knocked, her entry as casual as if it were her own space. Each visit carried an undercurrent of her power over him, a reminder of his failure. One afternoon, she entered unannounced, her smile as dazzling as ever. "You look tense, Elijah," she said, closing the door behind her. "Let me help you relax." "Delilah, this has to stop," he said, his voice strained. "You're making it impossible for me to focus on my calling, my family, everything." She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "I'm not the one making things difficult. You're the one running from what we both know is real." "You don't understand," he shot back, his frustration boiling over. "I'm trying to fix this, but you're pulling me deeper into a place I can't escape from." Delilah's expression hardened. "You don't want to escape, Elijah. You want me as much as I want you. But if you're worried about appearances, don't be. No one suspects a thing. As far as they're concerned, I'm the best thing that's ever happened to this church." Her words stung because they were true. How could he rally anyone against her when she had already won their hearts? The affair escalated, each encounter dragging Elijah further into despair. He longed to confess, but the fear of losing everything, his family, his church, his reputation, kept him silent. Grace, ever watchful, began to see the cracks forming in the church's foundation. Delilah's influence was growing too strong, her presence overshadowing even Elijah's leadership. Quietly, Grace reached out to a few trusted women in the church, sharing her concerns without revealing too much. "I think we need to pray for Pastor Elijah," she said during a women's prayer meeting. "There's a heaviness in his spirit, and I believe our church is under spiritual attack. Let's stand together in prayer for our pastor and for wisdom in the decisions ahead." Her words planted seeds of awareness, though no one suspected Delilah to be the cause. Meanwhile, Elijah wrestled with how to expose Delilah's true intentions. He knew that confronting her outright would be fruitless, but the longer he waited, the more entrenched she became. One evening, after a particularly charged encounter in his office, Elijah dropped to his knees in desperation. "Lord, I've failed you," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I've let my weakness lead me into sin, and now I'm lost. Show me how to make this right. Help me protect my family, my church, and myself from this darkness." Elijah and Delilah's secret affair continued to escalate. Grace had become increasingly aware of the growing tension in their marriage. Elijah, once a man of faith, now seemed to live in a world of excuses. He was constantly late, always working. Late at the office or dealing with urgent church matters when, in reality, he was spending hours with Delilah. Grace's suspicions were no longer just fleeting thoughts. She had seen the signs: Elijah's mood swings, his distracted behavior, the way he was glued to his phone, constantly texting or taking calls. More often than not, the caller ID had flashed Delilah or unknown, and Grace's heart had sunk each time. The church community, though unaware of the full extent of the situation, could feel that something was off. There were whispers among the members, concerned glances exchanged during services, hushed conversations after church events. People who had once admired their pastor were now starting to question his integrity. They could see it in his eyes, the disconnect in his sermons, the lack of passion in his words. It was as though he had lost his fire. But Grace? She had known the truth. She had felt it in the pit of her stomach. The betrayal had been brewing for weeks, maybe longer. One day, she had watched as Elijah left their house yet again, this time with an unusual urgency. As he drove off, Grace had caught a glimpse of his phone screen through the car window. There, it was, Delilah's name flashing on the screen. This was no longer a suspicion, it was a fact. Elijah, her husband, had become emotionally entangled with Delilah. His visits to her house had grown more frequent, and his excuses for his absences were growing thinner by the day. It was clear now, Grace wasn't just dealing with a husband who had lost interest in her, she was dealing with a man fully immersed in an affair. The pain cut deeper than words could express. Grace could no longer ignore the truth. She felt betrayed, not just by the man she had once adored, but by the life they had built together. The trust, the vows, they felt shattered beyond repair. The church that had been their home, the community they had nurtured, now stood as a silent witness to Elijah's decline. The hardest part, however, wasn't the affair itself. It was the feeling of being invisible to Elijah, of being replaced by someone who commanded his attention so effortlessly. Grace had given him everything, her love, her loyalty, her faith, but now she was left with the bitter taste of abandonment. One evening, after Elijah returned from yet another visit to Delilah, Grace decided she could no longer remain passive. The silence between them had stretched too long, and she could no longer pretend that everything was fine. "Elijah," she said quietly, standing in the doorway of their living room, "I know what's been going on." He froze, caught off guard. For a moment, there was a flicker of guilt in his eyes, but it quickly vanished, replaced by defensive anger. "What are you talking about?" "Delilah," Grace said, her voice steady but filled with pain. "I see the calls, Elijah. I see how you've been spending more time with her than with me. You've been lying to me, and I'm done pretending." "I don't know," Elijah sighed, running a hand through his hair. The shame was palpable, but there was also something else: resignation. "Grace, I'm sorry, but I'm not the man you think I am anymore." The words hit Grace like a slap. The man she had once loved had vanished, replaced by someone she barely recognized. Her heart ached with a mixture of betrayal and sorrow, but the truth was clear. Their marriage was beyond repair. It wasn't just the affair, it was the loss of everything they had built together. Grace stood there for a long moment, her eyes locked with his. She knew what she had to do. It was time to let go. "You've made your choice, Elijah. she said, her voice breaking. Now I need to make mine. As she turned to leave, Elijah didn't try to stop her. Maybe he knew, deep down, that this was the end. Later, at Delilah's house, the atmosphere had been thick with tension, yet there was an undeniable sense of urgency in her words. The cozy living room, dimly lit, had felt like a cocoon for the two of them, isolated from the world they had left behind. Elijah sat across from Delilah, the weight of his guilt and confusion evident in his eyes, but there was a flicker of something else, too: temptation. Delilah, with her perfect smile and magnetic presence, leaned in closer, her voice soft but persuasive. "You don't need this church thing, Elijah," she said, her tone smooth and enticing, as if she were offering him an escape from his life, from his responsibilities. "I have enough money for the both of us. We can start a new life, together." She paused, letting her words sink in, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her wine glass. "Let's leave this dirty little town, away from all the people who only care about appearances. We don't need them, Elijah. We could have everything we've ever wanted. Just you and me." Elijah listened, torn between the woman who had offered him an escape from the pressures of his life and the lingering pull of his responsibilities, the family he had let slip away, the ministry he had sworn to uphold. His heart was in turmoil, but the allure of Delilah's offer felt like a lifeline, a way out from the suffocating weight of guilt and expectation. "You know how things are here," Delilah continued, her voice dropping lower, coaxing him in. "All the people who don't really care about you, they only care about your title, your position. You deserve more than this small-town fake facade. With me, you can have everything, Elijah. I can make it happen. All you have to do is choose me. Choose us." There was a moment of silence as Elijah wrestled with the reality of the life he had and the future Delilah was promising. His mind spun with visions of freedom, of a life unburdened by the constraints of his former self. For a fleeting moment, the weight of his conscience slipped away. Delilah was offering him a fresh start, a new identity, a chance to escape the brokenness of his marriage and the guilt of his infidelity. But even as he leaned in closer to her, he knew the truth. This was not just a promise of a new life. It was the destruction of everything he had once believed in, everything he had once stood for. His mind flashed back to Grace, her face, the love in her eyes, the vows they had exchanged. Elijah looked away for a moment, but Delilah's words pulled him back. "Come on, Elijah," she urged. "What are you waiting for? You know this town, these people. They will never understand you like I do. Let's start over. We don't need to answer to anyone anymore." He felt the pull again, stronger this time. What did he have left to lose? The family, the ministry. They felt like distant memories, overshadowed by the lure of a new life with Delilah. His hesitation grew weaker, but deep down in the pit of his stomach, a quiet voice whispered, the voice of regret, of doubt. For the briefest moment, he thought of Grace, of their past, of the faith he once had. It all seemed so far away now, as if it belonged to another man. Elijah's words hung in the air, thick with the weight of his confession. Delilah's smile widened, a sense of victory gleaming in her eyes as she leaned in closer. She knew she had him now, his resolve crumbling before her as he whispered, "I realize that it's you that I love. I love you, Delilah." His voice was almost hypnotic, a man lost in a trance of desire and desperation. The barriers between them seemed to melt away, and as he reached for her, his heart raced with anticipation. The world outside no longer mattered. But just as their lips were about to meet, the moment was shattered by a loud, forceful knocking on the door. The sound was jarring, breaking the spell that had enveloped Elijah. He pulled back, startled, his mind quickly snapping back to reality, while Delilah's expression darkened with an unsettling calm. "Who is that?" Elijah asked, his voice laced with confusion and tension. Delilah stood up quickly, her eyes darting toward the door, her body tense as if she could already sense the gravity of the situation. "Stay here," she ordered, her voice sharp, her composure suddenly regained. She moved swiftly to the door, her face pale but her movements controlled. Elijah followed her instinctively, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure of what was happening. The knocking continued, louder this time, insistent. Delilah hesitated for a split second, her hand trembling as it hovered over the door handle. "I've got to face this," she muttered to herself, though Elijah heard her clearly. When she opened the door, a group of officers from the Criminal Investigation Unit stood on the other side, their presence commanding and authoritative. One of the officers stepped forward, showing his badge, his expression grim. "Delilah," he said, his voice cold. "We need to talk to you. You're under investigation." Elijah froze, his heart sinking as he watched the scene unfold. His mind raced, and for a moment, it felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. He stared at Delilah, the woman he had come to love, now standing at the center of a storm far bigger than he had ever imagined. Her facade cracked for a split second. Her eyes widened with fear. "Investigation? What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice steady, though Elijah noticed the way her hands trembled at her sides. The officer didn't flinch. "We have reason to believe you were involved in a major financial theft. Your ex-husband's activities, Delilah. You're connected. We need you to come with us." Elijah felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. The woman he had thought was his escape, his fresh start, was now at the center of a criminal investigation. The revelations came crashing down on him like a tidal wave. Delilah, the alluring figure who had promised him everything, was tangled in something far darker than their affair. Delilah looked at Elijah one last time, her eyes a mix of defiance and something else. Regret, perhaps. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but then she steeled herself. "I have to go, but I will be back. I promise you that." The officers moved in, escorting her out the door, leaving Elijah standing frozen in the dimly lit living room. The weight of everything, the affair, the lies, the shattered illusions, pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. Elijah was rooted to the spot, unable to comprehend what had just happened. His mind spun as he watched. Delilah being led away, the reality of her betrayal and the danger he was now caught in, slowly dawning on him. The love he thought he had found with her now felt like a trap, a lie intricately woven with deceit. As the door shut behind the officers, Elijah stood in stunned silence, the weight of his choices crashing down on him. His love for Delilah had cost him everything, his marriage, his integrity, and now, perhaps even his freedom. In that moment, Elijah knew he was lost. But the question remained. What came next? The tension in the room thickened as Elijah remained frozen in Delilah's now empty house. The image of her being escorted away by the police replayed in his mind, a sharp and painful reminder of how far he had fallen. His heart pounded, not just from the shock of what had transpired, but from the grim realization of where he was, in Delilah's house, just a stone's throw from the church. He glanced at the clock. It was late enough that most people in the IE neighborhood would be home, but what if someone had seen him enter? What if someone saw him leave? The shame of being connected to Delilah, now publicly linked to criminal activity, was suffocating. His thoughts spiraled as he stared out the window, watching the flashing lights of the police car fade into the distance. For a moment, Elijah contemplated staying, but the thought of being discovered there chilled him to the bone. What would people think? What would they say about their pastor? He knew the rumors had already been swirling, but this would confirm everything. Then, like a distant echo, Grace's face flashed in his mind. Her smile, her warmth, the unwavering faith she had in him. It felt like a memory from another life, a life he had all but destroyed. The guilt gnawed at him, sharp and relentless. How did I let it get this far? He thought. Grace had loved him deeply, supported him through everything. And yet here he was, standing in another woman's house, tangled in lies and disgrace. His heart ached with a mix of longing and regret, But he quickly shoved the thought aside. There was no going back now. Was there? He was finished. With a final glance around Delilah's house, Elijah knew he couldn't stay a second longer. He snuck to the back door, his movements hurried and clumsy. The shadows of the night seemed to mock him as he slipped out into the darkness, avoiding the well-lit street. The cool air hit his face as he hunched over, keeping low, his footsteps almost silent. He made his way to where his car was parked, a little distance away. As he drove home, his mind raced with questions. What would happen to Delilah now? She was in police custody, and the charges sounded serious. Would she fight them? Would she drag him down with her if the investigation uncovered their relationship? He shuddered at the thought. And Grace? What? About Grace? Did she even care anymore? Did she know where he'd been? What he'd done? A pang of guilt washed over him. The thought of facing her felt unbearable, yet he knew he must. When he finally reached home, the house was dark. Grace was likely asleep, or pretending to be. Elijah hesitated on the doorstep, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like never before. He opened the door quietly, stepping into the stillness of their home. It felt foreign now, like he no longer belonged there. In the quiet of the night, Elijah sat alone in the living room, staring at nothing. His mind replayed the events of the evening, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the crushing weight of his sins. The betrayal, the lies, the secrets. They had consumed him, and now he was left with the ruins of his choices. As for Delilah, her future was uncertain. The charges against her were serious, and her connection to her ex-husband's crimes could mean years in prison. Elijah wondered if she would try to contact him, to pull him deeper into her mess. But part of him knew that whatever they had was built on a foundation of deceit, and now it was crumbling. And Grace? She lay awake in their bedroom, staring at the ceiling. She knew Elijah was home, and she knew where he was coming from. She had heard the door creak open, but she felt no relief, no comfort in his return. She had been praying, asking God for strength, for guidance. And now she was left wondering, was there anything left to save? As the night stretched on, the silence in their home felt louder than ever, a chasm growing between them. And in that silence, the consequences of Elijah's choices hung heavy, with no easy way out. Morning came with a quiet stillness, the sun casting its soft light through the curtains of Grace and Elijah's home. Grace sat at the kitchen table, her hands cradling a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She hadn't slept much, her mind racing through the night. She had made up her mind. This is it. I can't live like this anymore. She had already packed her bags, tucked away in the corner of their bedroom, ready to leave the life she once cherished but no longer recognized. Elijah's betrayal had been the final blow, and she couldn't bear the constant pain of his absence, not just physically but emotionally and spiritually. As she stirred her tea absent-mindedly, the sound of voices outside caught her attention. She peered through the window and saw a group of neighbors talking animatedly, their expressions a mix of shock and intrigue. A few of them glanced in the direction of her house, and Grace's heart sank. She stepped closer to the window, her curiosity piqued, and overheard snippets of their conversation. Can you believe it? Delilah was arrested last night. They say it's tied to her ex-husband's crimes, something about stolen money. And our pastor, he was seen leaving her house late at night. What's going on there? The words hit Grace like a tidal wave. Delilah? Arrested? She stepped back from the window, her hand covering her mouth. Her thoughts raced, colliding with each other in a storm of emotions. Did God answer my prayers? She had prayed fervently, for weeks asking God to reveal the truth, to bring an end to the torment Elijah's infidelity had caused. And now, here it was. Delilah, exposed and taken away. But the relief Grace expected didn't come. Instead, she felt a deep unease. What did this mean for Elijah? For them? She glanced toward the packed bags in the bedroom. She had planned to. leave without a word, letting her absence speak the truth Elijah had been avoiding. But now she hesitated. She knew Elijah had been avoiding her, coming home late, sneaking into bed, barely speaking a word. The man who had once prayed with her, who had led their congregation with such passion, now seemed like a shadow of himself. But this morning, she sensed something different. The air in the house felt heavier, as if Elijah's shame had finally caught up with him. Grace decided to confront him. She found him sitting in the living room, slumped in an armchair, his face buried in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his eyes red and tired. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. "Elijah," Grace began, her voice steady but firm, "I heard about Delilah. Is it true?" He nodded slowly, unable to meet her gaze. "It's true," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She's been arrested. They think she's connected to her ex-husband's crimes. I don't even know the full story." Grace took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. "And you? What were you doing at her house last night?" Elijah flinched at the question, his shame spilling over. I made a mistake, Grace. A terrible mistake. I thought..." His voice broke and he shook his head. "I don't know what I thought. I've been so lost." Grace felt tears sting her eyes, but she fought them back. "Lost? You think..." "That justifies what you've done? The lies, the betrayal, the humiliation?" Her voice rose and she stepped closer to him. "I prayed, Elijah. I prayed for God to show me what to do, and now this. Is this his answer?" Elijah looked up at her, his face filled with desperation. "I don't know, Grace. I don't know how to fix this. I've hurt you. I've hurt the church. I've hurt myself. I don't deserve your forgiveness." He looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "Grace, please. I know I've failed you, but don't give up on me. I need help. I need you. I can't do this alone." Grace took a step back, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. She knew this decision would define the rest of her life. As she looked at Elijah, broken and repentant, she realized she had a choice to make: to stay and fight for their marriage, or to walk away and start anew. In her heart, she prayed silently, asking God for guidance, knowing that whatever path she chose, it would not be easy. As Grace stepped out of the house, the weight of her decision settled heavily on her shoulders. The morning air was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of dew and faint whispers of life awakening in the neighborhood. Her suitcase, though not overly heavy, felt like it carried the burden of her broken heart. She didn't look back. There was no reason to. Behind her was the home she had built with Elijah, the memories of a love she once believed was unshakable, and the pain of betrayal that had brought her to this moment. Her steps were steady, but her heart was in turmoil. She had prayed for clarity, for strength to make the right choice, and now, after all the lies and humiliation, she had finally decided to leave. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was the only one that made sense. As she walked, the sound of her suitcase wheels against the pavement seemed deafening in the quiet street. Her mind raced with thoughts of what her future would hold. Where do I go from here? What's next? And then, in the stillness of the moment, something happened. A soft, unmistakable whisper stirred within her soul. It wasn't audible to the world, but to Grace. It was as clear as if someone had spoken directly to her heart. "Delilah left as an answer to your prayers, Grace. I wanted to restore your home." She froze mid-step, her heart pounding as if the words had physically stopped. Her hands trembled as she let go of the suitcase handle, her breath caught in her chest. "Restore my home?" she whispered aloud, her voice quivering with a mixture of disbelief and longing. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision as she looked up at the sky, searching for something, anything that could affirm what she had just felt. The weight of the words pressed deeply into her heart, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. She thought about Elijah, sitting alone in the house they once shared with laughter and prayer. She thought about his brokenness, his desperate plea for forgiveness, and the man he used to be, the man she had fallen in love with. Her feet felt rooted to the ground, unable to move forward. She clenched her fists, torn between her pain and the undeniable pull of God's voice. "Is this your will, Lord?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Is this your way of telling me not to give up?" She stood there for what felt like an eternity, the world around her fading into the background. Slowly, the Spirit's peace washed over her, quieting the storm in her heart. It didn't erase the pain or the betrayal, but it reminded her of something greater: the possibility of redemption, of healing, of grace. With a deep, trembling breath, Grace turned around. Her steps were hesitant at first, but as she approached the house, a sense of purpose began to grow within her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't ignore the voice she had heard. As she opened the door and stepped inside, she found Elijah still sitting in the living room, his face buried in his hands. He looked up, startled, as she entered. "Grace," he whispered, his voice filled with surprise and raw emotion. "You came back." She set her suitcase down and met his gaze, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what this means for us, Elijah," she said, her voice steady but soft. "But I know that God isn't finished with us yet. If he believes our home can be restored, then I'm willing to try." Elijah's expression crumbled as tears streamed down his face. He nodded, unable to speak, as Grace sat down across from him. For the first time in months, they bowed their heads together in prayer, asking for guidance, strength, and the grace to rebuild what had been broken. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Grace knew she wasn't walking it alone. As they sat, together on the couch, Elijah reached for Grace's hand, his grip firm but trembling. His heart was heavy with regret, but for the first time in months, it felt lighter, like a glimmer of hope had pierced through the thick darkness that had consumed him. "Let's pray," Elijah whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Grace nodded, her tears flowing freely now. Together, they bowed their heads, their fingers intertwined in a gesture of unity that had felt so distant not long ago. Elijah's voice broke as he began to speak. "God, oh God," he started, his words thick with anguish. "I've failed you. I've failed Grace, our church, and myself. But you didn't give up on me. You didn't give up on us. Thank you for bringing Grace back to me, for showing me that there's still a chance for redemption. I don't deserve it, Lord, but I ask for your guidance. Show me what to do next. Heal our hearts, heal our marriage, and heal the church that has been wounded by my sins." The tears flowed freely down Elijah's face, his words raw and unfiltered, pouring out like a dam that had finally broken. Grace squeezed his hand, her own tears falling silently as she whispered her own prayers, asking for strength, wisdom, and the courage to face the uncertain road ahead. That Sunday, the church was unusually full. Word of Delilah's arrest and the pastor's rumored struggles had spread through the congregation like wildfire. People whispered in the pews, speculating on what might happen next. But as the service began, there was an air of expectancy, a feeling that something important was about to take place. When Elijah and Grace walked in, hand, a hush fell over the room. Elijah's usual confident stride was absent. He walked with humility, his head slightly bowed, as if carrying the weight of his mistakes. Grace walked beside him, her face calm but resolute, her presence a testament to the strength and grace that God had given her. Elijah stood before the congregation, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his eyes scanning the room, "I come before you today not as your pastor, but as a man who has fallen short, terribly short, of the calling God placed on my life. I have sinned against God, against my wife, and against all of you." Gasps echoed through the room, and tears welled in the eyes of many. Elijah continued, his voice cracking. I allowed myself to be led astray, to compromise my integrity, and to bring shame to the position I hold. For that, I am deeply sorry. I know that an apology is not enough, and I am prepared to take the necessary steps to make amends, starting with stepping away from my role as your pastor. The room was silent, save for the occasional sniffle. Grace stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder as he spoke. Elijah gestured to the church board members seated in the front pew. I've spoken with the board, and we've agreed that it's in the best interest of this congregation for me to take a leave of absence. My wife and I have decided to step away and seek God's guidance and healing, not just for ourselves, but for this church as well. The head of the church board, an elderly man named Deacon Samuel, stepped forward. His voice was steady and compassionate as he addressed the congregation. As a church, we are called to forgive and to support one another, even in times of great difficulty. Pastor Elijah and Sister Grace will be taking time to seek the Lord's guidance. In the meantime, we've reached out to our former assistant pastor, Mark, who has recently completed his theological studies. He has agreed to step in as interim pastor while we navigate this season of transition. A wave of murmurs spread through the congregation, but the overall sentiment was one of understanding and grace. In the following days, Elijah and Grace packed their belongings, preparing to leave for a retreat center known for its focus on spiritual renewal and counseling. It wasn't an easy decision, but they knew it was the right one. They needed to heal, not just from the wounds of Elijah's actions, but also from the strain it had placed on their faith and their marriage. On their last Sunday in the church, before their departure, the congregation held a special service. Elijah and Grace sat in the front pew as Deacon Samuel led the congregation in prayer for their healing and restoration. As the prayers filled the sanctuary, Elijah felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. As they stood to leave, members of the church surrounded them, offering words of encouragement, hugs, and promises to pray for them. It was a bittersweet moment, but it was also a reminder of the power of grace and forgiveness. Outside the church, Elijah turned to Grace, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, he said softly, for staying, for believing that God could still work through this mess. Grace smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with tears. This isn't the end, Elijah. It's just the beginning of something new. As they drove away from the church, heading toward their retreat, they both felt a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but they knew they weren't walking it alone. God was with them, and so was the love they were beginning to rebuild, one step at a time. I believe you enjoyed this story. I hope you have been inspired, and for the men of God, a sound warning. When you think you are strong, remember you really are not. Rely on God totally to help you in your work. The devil comes as a roaring lion, or in this case as a wolf, seeking whom he may devour. Do not give him room. Do not be deceived like Elijah, who fell from grace. Subscribe to this channel to get more captivating content like this.